Coming in at number 10 is The Witcher 3. Like the other games in the series, The Witcher 3 is all about intricate world building with a complex branching narrative driven by your choices. The world is alive and populated with rich characters full of agency. The storytelling is front and center and the fiction is dense. Geralt makes choices that feel like they lead to believable consequences, and your dialogue with other characters does more than just boil down to good guy, bad guy, neutral guy responses. On top of that, The Witcher 3's world is rendered beautifully with love and care put into both the artistic and technical facets of the game. I deeply enjoy The Witcher 3 for the art, the stunning dynamic weather, the absorbing characters, the storytelling, the spins on classic fantasy monsters, the density of all the background information that constitutes this elaborate fiction, but also for one more thing. Something neither of the other Witcher games had. That something is Gwent, the greatest card-based minigame ever featured in an RPG. It is all about Gwent. If CD Projekt ever decides to expand on Gwent and spin it off into its own game with more depth, I will be down for that ride on day one. Gwent is life. Until Dawn has come a long way since its announcement as a motion control game for the PS3. In fact, around early 2013, with radio silence from Supermassive Games and hype brewing for the PS4, it seemed like Until Dawn was going to be cancelled. It was later retooled as a PS4 standalone title, and here we are. It's astounding for the rocky development cycle, bridging two console generations, that Until Dawn not only came out, but came out as good as it is. Even without the qualifiers, Until Dawn is really good at creating an authentic pastiche of 90s teen slashers that nails the formula while also taking several opportunities to turn classic horror tropes on their heads. The story's full of really clever twists that keep you guessing, and Supermassive plays with tension and foreshadowing really well. They throw out the obvious jump scares early on to get you to raise your guard later, only to kind of subvert that to their advantage. You creep around that corner positive of the obvious scare coming up, and nothing happens, so you put your guard back down, and then that's when it hits. They're very clever about how they pace their scares. There is also always something going on in the background of scenes. Sometimes you have to pay really careful attention, sometimes they're meant to just catch your eye in an obvious way. Sometimes they'll freak you out because of how subtle they are if you notice them at all. Sometimes whatever you see lurking around will pay off right away. Sometimes it'll just be there to make you paranoid. Then you have the tension of the infrequent don't move sections where it uses the gyro on the DualShock 4 to force you to stand absolutely still while the controller's motor gently rumbles. And if you even flinch a little bit, you suffer the consequences. Speaking of which, anyone can die in your group, and even though there are set moments in the story where a character can die, it feels really unpredictable the first time through not knowing what those points are. There are also a lot of branching decisions here which have very tangible impacts down the line, with some choices paying off hours after you make them. Until Dawn is a rock-solid homage to a bygone era of horror. It nails the cinematic presentation, it goes for better than any game ever has, and it's just a real treat to go through. A lot of my thoughts on Legacy of the Void can be summed up in my Game of the Year video from 2 years back where I named Heart of the Swarm my 2013 Game of the Year. Starcraft 2 is an enormous game with something for just about everybody, even if you're not that into RTS, to be honest. One of the most in-depth and thoughtfully crafted single-player campaigns ever in an RTS, which, to be honest, is kind of par for the course with Blizzard and their RTS campaigns. Legacy of the Void features an arcade featuring a shitload of custom maps built in the sprawling editor, and of course the main attraction, the multiplayer, now with Archon mode, where two people share control of one race. I think that Wings of Liberty was a rocky start for StarCraft 2. Its heart was in the right place. I think Heart of the Swarm was to Wings of Liberty what Brood War was to the original vanilla StarCraft 1, and I think Legacy of the Void continues to make one of the most beautiful competitive RTSs even better. I'm also so psyched that Lurkers are finally back, and most of the new units changed the dynamic of matches in pretty nifty ways. Korra might have been Platinum's most poorly received game ever. It's not Platinum's worst game. That distinction belongs to Infinite Space, and it honestly wasn't even really that bad. In fact, it wasn't bad at all, but expectations were unrealistically high for a budget downloadable character action game based on Nickelodeon's The Legend of Korra. Transformers Devastation's announcement was met with some nervousness as a result of Korra. Korra, this is not. It's still a budget game, but you mostly get that impression from the short length rather than from a dearth of content. For as small a game as Devastation is, though, it's bursting at the seams with Autobots and Decepticons and Constructicon and Dinobot and Insecticon nostalgia. This seems like a much greater labor of love. It's richer mechanically, it features classic Platinum hype and classic Platinum bosses, and it is beautiful. It is beautifully rendered in high contrast cell shading. Transformers isn't really my jam, and it never has been, but doesn't matter, I'm still sucked into this, just totally absorbed. This is a stylish action game featuring Optimus instead of Bayonetta, Grimlock instead of Dante, and Wheeljack instead of Raiden. It's terrific, it's deep, it's hype, and that's all I can ask for from a Platinum game. Mortal Kombat 9 was the first Mortal Kombat game with competitive ambition. Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 was tournament viable, and it does have a dedicated following, but they never really strived to make a real fighter until 9 came out. It was rough around the edges, but the ambition was really apparent, and it featured some of the most talked about single player for a fighting game that I can remember. Mortal Kombat X improves greatly upon the gameplay of 9, and it takes a slight step back on the single player. For a fighting game, that's a sacrifice that I will happily accept. Mortal Kombat X is aggressive as all hell, and it is 50-50s all day, every day, and that's not going to please everyone, but it sits happily in the middle of Street Fighter 4's deliberate, slower-paced play and the balls-to-the-wall chaos of Marvel, and that's a good niche to fill. The new stamina gauge governs backdashes and running and breakers, and that adds a fundamental interesting wrinkle to gameplay, but the biggest change from 9 to 10, other than tightening a few subsystems up in the game feel, is the addition of variations to characters. Variations essentially triple the size of the roster. Every character has 3 variations, which fundamentally change how they play. Normal moves often have different properties, each variation has a different suite of specials, and characters receive certain buffs depending on which variation you pick for them. Let's use Kotal Khan as an example. He has a War God variation, a Blood God variation, and a Sun God variation. His War God variation gives him a sword with some really good armored specials that make him just a mix-up monster. Blood God gives him a bunch of temporary summonable totems that give him buffs ranging from stuff like more armor to damage reduction, and Sun God is all about command grabs. Speaking of Kotal Khan, all of the newcomers to Mortal Kombat X, 8 in total, are awesome. There isn't a bad design in the bunch, there isn't a bad character among them. That is astounding considering the overwhelming majority of Mortal Kombat newcomers after like Mortal Kombat 3 were god-awful, save for, I don't know, Bo-Rai Cho and Kenshi. My only gripe with Mortal Kombat X is its atrocious netcode, which has only been improved marginally over time. Aside from that, I think Mortal Kombat X is a genuinely great fighting game. Splatoon is the freshest shooter release in the better part of a decade. It is beautiful, it's got tons of style, it's got really unique mechanics, and its objective-based play is reminiscent of those old graffiti modes from a bygone era of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Your team's goal is to cover a bigger chunk of the map in your colored paint than the enemy team before the time runs out. You can do it with Super Soaker-style guns, paintbrushes, ink grenades, rollers. There is a tremendous amount of variety to the weapons and the ways that you can actually cover the ground in paint. Nintendo's also been releasing a steady drip of content and themed contests and modes and maps and gear and weapons. In fact, I think just the other day a new map or two came out, and it's all been coming out for free. It feels good to play, it's got a lot of cool, quirky mechanics, like you can turn into a squid and surf around in the ink that you've laid down and use it to go up walls and through solid objects like gates. It's awesome, it's fantastic. And it's also got a really solid single-player mode with a lot of quirky, inventive bosses I was just constantly surprised by. I can't really fault anything about Splatoon, it's so good, I love it. It also kind of tickles my love for horrendous, punny humor. Splatoon is incredible. I loved the atmosphere of Penumbra and Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and upon playing The Dark Descent again, I realized that it features a really intriguing story, but its problem has always been poor storytelling. Frictional's latest outing, Soma, remedies that while also telling a story that is thematically much more interesting than Amnesia's, and it also features a far more refreshing setting. The imagery and the art are leagues more disturbing, the deep sea labs are claustrophobic and frightening, and the crushing abyss of the ocean makes you feel constantly unsafe. And the abyss section near the end of the game was some of the most genuinely horrific stuff that I've experienced in a game since early Silent Hill. The game spends most of its time not hitting that high watermark of pure dread, but it makes up for that with existential terror. Soma is a thematic exploration of personhood and what it means to be human, and it spends the entire length of the game tackling those classic sci-fi themes from every conceivable angle. It's an interrogation of the notion of the self. It deconstructs what it means to be a person, and some of the conclusions that you draw from that are just terrifying. Soma might not be as spooky as The Dark Descent, but it should be held up high as a sci-fi instant classic. In trying to convey why Undertale is so good, some people can make it seem like Undertale is this grand genre reinvention or something that's revolutionary, and that hype can really sour someone on it. The game isn't really something that's never been done before, never been seen before, but what it is refreshing. First off, it meticulously tracks what you do, and it makes you very aware of the fact that it's doing that. It frequently breaks the fourth wall to remind you. If you restart the game, if you start a new save file, if you die to a boss and try again, the game knows, and it does some clever things with that knowledge. Second, it mixes turn-based menu-driven combat with active time bullet hell to keep things engaging. And while you can kill anything that you come across, it's often more fun to try to solve each enemy and find a way to mercy them instead. Killing every enemy does lead you down a much harder path, and a very different one at that, but any more you'll have to discover for yourself. Finally, Undertale is a feel-good game. Even through its multiple endings, all of which escalate through the roof and some of which are kind of bittersweet, the game is ultimately a more tender experience than most. It's about characters you come to really enjoy being in the company of, and it's about heart. Its moments of darkness reinforce the more plentiful feel-good moments, and they reinforce your love for the characters. Part of its feel-good charm is also in the humor. I haven't laughed so much during a game since Portal 2 and Portal 1 before that, and I came away from Undertale feeling like its quirks and charms were just tailored to suit my specific tastes. And I suspect a lot of people are going to come away from Undertale with a similar kind of intimate experience. Undertale, for that reason, is to me a small wonder. Ori and the Blind Forest is so magical. Its art is painterly and picturesque, and you just melt into those beautiful backgrounds of tranquil fairy tale whimsy. But it's got a lot more going on than just whimsy and a pretty aesthetic. Ori is quiet and meditative and feel good one moment, it's heart-wrenching the next, and it's just plain intense and nail-biting the moment after that. For as soft and palatable as the art is, it belies some pretty brutal difficulty in the mid to late game, and some really challenging puzzle platforming throughout. There are some puzzles in this that will stick with me for a very long time, and some set-piece escape sequences like one where you're platforming vertically as a flash flood is rising beneath you. Stuff like that left a lasting, heart-pounding impression. Ori is incredibly well-rounded. It's challenging, it's beautiful, it's gaming ecstasy that I can't quite do justice to in just the minute or two that I have. You all know what my game of the year is going to be, even though we haven't gotten there yet. It should tell you a lot about how fond I am of Ori that this game came along and even for a brief moment gave me a flash of doubt about what my game of the year pick for 2015 was going to be. Speaking of which, it probably couldn't be less surprising that my pick for Game of the Year 2015 is Bloodborne. I am overwhelmed by not only how much I like Bloodborne, but by how many different aspects of it that I like. I could talk about the hair-raising soundtrack, or the hauntingly beautiful rendition of decaying Victorian architecture that gradually slips into something otherworldly and gruesome and disturbing, in lockstep with a lore-based narrative that gradually turns from a gothic horror story featuring werewolves and vampires into something distinctly and deliberately Lovecraftian. I could talk about the astounding array of varied, grotesque bosses ranging from gigantic beasts to humanoid duels that constantly top themselves as some of the series' best. I could talk about the blistering pace and perfect game feel, but Bloodborne's heart and soul hinge on one particular mechanic. That mechanic just happens to be the largest common denominator between Souls games and this. The identity of Bloodborne lives and dies by its dashing. Its more aggressive pace is facilitated by the speed and grace with which you dash around. Its complex duels are the beautiful result of the dance you can engage with because of the dash. The foregoing of a shield depends on the smooth and precise motions of your character whipping around enemies. It's a beautiful, elegant, and simple mechanic that elevates a formula that's been tempered since Demon's Souls, or even as far back as Kingsfield. In Bloodborne, you're more vulnerable than you've ever been, but you're also way more capable than you've ever been. It's the logical extreme of something that I've always loved about From RPGs, the difference that mastery can make. You go from a mewling, scared heap to an untouchable badass, not because you leveled your stats up enough, but because you mastered a really awesome system. Empowerment is a result of you leveling up, not your character leveling up. This is the birth of what I would deem character action horror. Bloodborne is the antithesis of a typical power fantasy, and yet it can emergently turn into a power fantasy. I could easily go on and on and on about Bloodborne, and in fact I have in the LP, but if you don't understand what I see in Bloodborne by now, it's probably a lost cause. Bloodborne is emphatically my game of the year for 2015.